That afternoon, Kris Kristofferson had 12 seconds. If he answered the question the way it was asked, something he'd kept separate from explanation would become public property, and he'd never get it back. The radio host was leaning forward. The tape was rolling. The studio was small enough that silence had weight. "That line," the host said again, "wishing, Lord, that I was stoned. What were you really trying to say there?" Kris didn't flinch. He didn't deflect with humor. He just let the question sit for a moment longer than comfort allowed. Then he smiled, not warmly, but thoughtfully, and began talking about craft. It was 1970. Sunday Morning Comin' Down had already been recorded by Ray Stevens, then by Johnny Cash. Cash's version had gone to #1. The song had become a standard before most people knew who wrote it. Kris had written it 3 years earlier in a small apartment that smelled like old coffee and cigarette smoke. He'd been hungover. He'd been alone. He'd watched people through the window, families, couples, people who seemed to belong to the day in a way he didn't. The song came quickly, too quickly for something that precise. He didn't revise much. He didn't explain it to himself. He just wrote it down and moved on. By the time Johnny Cash recorded it, the song had stopped being private. It belonged to the culture now. It belonged to everyone who heard themselves in it. But that one line, the one the host kept returning to, still felt like his. Not because it was confessional, because it was exact. The host was younger, enthusiastic, the kind of interviewer who treated songs like puzzles to be solved. "I mean," he said, "it's such a specific image. The Sunday school across the street, the father and the daughter, and then that line about wishing you were stoned. It's almost, I don't know, vulnerable?" Kris nodded slowly. He looked like he was considering it. He wasn't. He was deciding how much distance to create. "I think," Kris said carefully, "what I was after was the contrast. You've got this very American, very wholesome scene, Sunday morning, church bells, families dressed up. And then you've got this guy who's on the outside of all that. He's not part of it. He can't be. And the loneliness of that, it's almost unbearable. So the line is about wanting relief. Any kind of relief." The host nodded. "Right. Relief from what, though?" Kris smiled again. This time it was softer, more patient. "From being awake for it." The answer was good. It was articulate. It even sounded true. It just wasn't complete. The host seemed satisfied. He moved on to the next question. Something about working with Johnny Cash, about Nashville, about the shift from writing songs in obscurity to suddenly being recognized. Kris answered each question the same way. Thoughtful, generous, just distant enough. No one followed up. The interview wrapped 20 minutes later. The host shook his hand, told him it was an honor. Kris thanked him, said he appreciated the care in the questions, and then he left. What he didn't say, what he'd chosen not to say, was this. The line wasn't about relief. It was about disappearing. Not from the scene, from himself. That Sunday morning 3 years earlier, he hadn't just been hungover. He'd been aware, painfully, relentlessly aware, of the separateness, of the fact that no amount of walking or observing or writing was going to close the distance between him and the life he was watching. He'd wanted to be stoned not to feel better, but to feel less. And that distinction, that small private truth, wasn't something he was willing to hand over. Not because it was shameful, because it was accurate. And once you explain something that precisely, it stops being yours. It becomes a reference point, a talking point, a way for other people to understand you in a way you didn't agree to. Kris had learned this early, before Nashville, before the songs became hits, before anyone cared who wrote them. He'd been a literature student, a Rhodes Scholar, someone who understood that meaning and explanation weren't the same thing. In graduate school, he'd read the poets who withheld as much as they revealed. Dickinson, Frost, the ones who trusted the reader to feel what they didn't say. He'd carried that with him into songwriting. The best songs, he believed, worked like photographs. They captured a moment, a feeling, a specific slant of light. But they didn't explain it. Explanation killed the image. And once the image was gone, all you had left was commentary. By 1970, Kris had become good at this, at giving answers that sounded full but left the center untouched. Interviewers would ask about his time as a janitor at Columbia Records, about the helicopter landing on Johnny Cash's lawn, about flying to offshore oil rigs to make money between gigs. He'd tell the stories. He'd make them interesting. He'd give just enough detail to satisfy. But he never told them what it felt like. What it felt like to clean studios where other people's songs were being recorded. To know he was capable of writing better and to have no way of proving it. What it felt like to be respected for his mind. Oxford, Pomona, a military family, and to choose a life that looked like failure from the outside. He kept that part quiet, not out of shame, out of protection. The radio interview aired 2 weeks later. Kris didn't listen to it. He didn't avoid it out of discomfort. He just didn't need to. He already knew what he'd said and what he hadn't. A few people mentioned it to him, said he'd been articulate, thoughtful, that he'd given a good explanation of the song. He thanked them. No one asked what he'd left out. This was the part Kris had come to understand, maybe too well. Most people didn't want the whole truth. They wanted a version of it, one that fit their sense of who he was, who they needed him to be. The thoughtful songwriter, the former Rhodes Scholar who walked away from a conventional life, the guy who wrote songs that felt personal but weren't quite confessional. And he could give them that. He could be articulate about loneliness without exposing his own. He could talk about craft without admitting how much of it was instinct. He could discuss a song's imagery without confessing what the imagery was standing in for. It wasn't dishonest. It was just incomplete. And incompleteness, he'd learned, was a form of privacy. There were moments, though, when the incompleteness felt heavier than the exposure would have been. Late nights after shows, quiet conversations with other songwriters, times when someone would ask a question that wasn't looking for an answer, just acknowledgement. Do you ever feel like the songs know more than you do? Do you ever write something and then realize you can't take it back? Kris would nod. He'd let the silence confirm what words wouldn't. But he wouldn't go further. Because going further meant admitting that some of the songs weren't explorations. They were reports. And once you admitted that, you couldn't pretend you didn't know what you were reporting on. In 1973, 3 years after the radio interview, Kris was in a hotel room in Los Angeles. He'd just finished a small acoustic set, the kind of show where the audience was close enough to see his hands on the guitar, to hear him breathe between lines. Afterward, a younger songwriter approached him, someone Kris didn't know but recognized as serious. "Can I ask you something?" the kid said. Kris nodded. "That line in Sunday Morning about wishing you were stoned, did you mean it literally, or was it more symbolic?" Kris looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled. The same smile from the radio interview, thoughtful, patient, just far enough away. "I think," Kris said, "it's whatever the listener needs it to be." The kid nodded, seemed satisfied. Kris excused himself. What he wanted to say, what he almost said, was this. It was literal, and it was symbolic. And the reason I can't tell you which one matters more is because I don't want to choose. But he didn't say it. Because once you say something like that, it becomes the definitive answer. It gets quoted, it gets referenced, it becomes the way people understand the song. And the song didn't need that. It needed to stay open. This was the cost Kris had accepted. Not fame, not scrutiny, not even misunderstanding. The cost was this. He would always know more than he said. And that gap between what he knew and what he shared would widen every time he chose restraint over honesty. It wasn't tragic. It wasn't even painful. It was just permanent. By the late 1970s, Kris had been interviewed hundreds of times. He'd talked about his songs, his acting, his time in the army, his decision to leave a conventional path. He'd gotten better at it, smoother, more skilled at giving answers that felt complete without actually closing the loop. But every so often, someone would ask about that line, "Wishing, Lord, that I was stoned." And every time, he'd find a new way to talk around it. Sometimes he'd focus on the imagery, the contrast between the Sunday school and the isolation. Sometimes he'd talk about the character in the song, the narrator as someone separate from himself. Sometimes he'd redirect entirely, talk about Johnny Cash's version, about how Cash understood the song in a way that didn't require explanation, and it always worked. Because people weren't listening for evasion, they were listening for insight, and Kris knew how to give them one without the other. In 1981, a journalist asked him if he'd ever written a line he regretted. Kris thought about it, not about the answer, about whether to tell the truth. "No," he said finally. "I don't think so." The journalist nodded, moved on. What Kris didn't say was this. He didn't regret the line. He regretted that it was accurate. Because here's what he'd learned. You can live with loneliness. You can even write about it. You can turn it into something other people recognize and feel less alone because of. But if you explain it, if you make it clear and definable and complete, it stops being a feeling and becomes a fact. And facts don't comfort anyone. They just confirm what was already suspected. The last time someone asked Kris about that line was in 1987. He was older now, grayer. His face had settled into the expression it would carry for the rest of his life. Thoughtful, distant, kind. The interviewer was older too, someone who'd been around long enough to know not to push. "That line," the interviewer said, "the one everyone asks about, do you still connect with it?" Kris looked at him. For a moment, it seemed like he might answer differently, like the years had given him enough distance to be honest. But then he smiled. "I think," he said, "it's one of those lines that means different things depending on when you hear it." The interviewer nodded. "And what does it mean to you now?" Kris paused, not because he didn't know, because he did. "I think," he said slowly, "it means I understood something I didn't want to understand." The interviewer waited. Kris didn't continue. The interview moved on. They talked about his film career, about his collaborations, about the younger generation of songwriters who cited him as an influence. Kris was generous, articulate, present in the way people expected. And when it was over, he thanked the interviewer, shook his hand, said it had been a good conversation. No one asked what he meant by understanding something he didn't want to understand. Because that's the thing about restraint. People respect it. They don't question it. And if you're careful, if you stay thoughtful and kind and just withholding enough, you can live your entire life explaining things without ever actually confessing them. Kris Kristofferson wrote Sunday Morning Comin Down in 1969. By the time he stopped doing interviews, he'd talked about it hundreds of times. He'd explained the imagery, the contrast, the loneliness, the craft. He'd made it make sense. But that one line, the one everyone asked about, never got a full answer. Not because he didn't have one, because the answer was too exact. And exactness, he'd learned, was the one thing you couldn't take back. So he lived with it. The gap between what he knew and what he said, the space between the song and the explanation, the moment he chose distance over exposure and made it look like generosity. No one called it evasion. They called it depth, and he let them.